bodybuilding.com kitchen, excited to show you how I make my cinnamon swirl protein bread. It's one of my favorite things to eat. I can eat it as a snack or even as a meal because it's got your healthy carb and your healthy protein. So let's get started. First thing you're gonna wanna do is preheat your oven to 350 degrees. The next thing I did was I got my pan ready. This is a 8 by 8 inch Pyrex dish. I just did a light little nonstick spray and you can set that aside. And then I got all my ingredients together, and for this I want a large bowl for my dry ingredients and a smaller bowl for my wet ingredients. So the first ingredient I'm using is oat flour. In the supermarket, this is what oat flour looks like. Now I'm often asked if this is gluten-free, and oats typically are gluten-free, but one thing to note is that unless it doesn't indicate it on the bag, you're never really sure if maybe it was cross-contaminated in processing. So for this one, it doesn't indicate gluten-free, but for the most part, oats are. But if you're concerned, be sure to look for that indication on the label. If you can't find the oats in the supermarket, you can actually make your own. You can use a coffee grinder and just grind a little bit at a time, or you could use a blender. Just make sure to know that sometimes you can't get it as finely ground as what's in the package, so you might have to increase the amount that you're using for the recipe. In this large bowl, I've added 1.5 cups of the oat flour, and to that, I'm gonna add a vanilla whey protein. Now you can use whichever one you'd like. There's 2 scoops in here. Make sure to know though that the different flavors from the different manufacturers will make them taste differently. So I like to use one that has as few ingredients in it as possible. The cleaner the better. So I'm gonna dump that into my oat flour. And then to that, I'm gonna add my salt. Now if you use a leavening agent like baking soda or baking powder, you usually need salt because that makes it react. Add those in. And then to this dry ingredient batter, I'm gonna actually add 1/4 cup of stevia. This is what stevia looks like at the supermarket. Stevia is a great natural sweetener because it's no calorie and it has no carb, but I don't typically use just stevia alone to sweeten my recipes because it can be kind of bitter. There's different brands of stevia. There's stevia and there's another brand called Truvia. Truvia is a great option too, but it's typically more expensive. There's 2 sides to the stevia plant. This one tends to be slightly more bitter. It is cheaper. And then the Truvia, you usually see it in packets or in a little tiny tub for baking. We're going the cheap route today. So that's it for our dry ingredients. We do have these 2 other ingredients. These are the extra special ones that just make it extra yummy, but we're gonna use those later, so I'm gonna keep those to the side. I'm gonna get my whisk and just mix this up really well. Make sure I get that baking powder all incorporated because sometimes if you don't, it won't bake evenly. So I think that looks good. So I'm gonna set that to the side and get this smaller bowl ready for my wet ingredients. For the wet ingredients, we're gonna need 2 egg whites. You can actually use a whole egg if you wanna use a whole egg, but I prefer to minimize the fat in pretty much any recipe if I can do that. And my second egg. If you ever drop the yolk in there, you can just use the same shell to fish it out. It comes right out, so I've dropped plenty. And then to the eggs, I'm gonna add 1 jar of baby food applesauce. Now you can use regular applesauce, but one of the reasons I like the baby food brand is there's typically no additives. As long as you read the label, there's no additives and it's nice and portion controlled. So I'll open that, get all the good stuff off the top, and then scoop this out. But again, just unsweetened applesauce from the jar, that works just as well. That's my additional sweetener, one of them, to the stevia, which actually will cut some of that bitterness. Next thing I'm gonna add is gonna be my yogurt. And I choose Greek yogurt because Greek yogurt actually has less sugar and it has added protein. So I only need 1/2 container of this. So I'm gonna scoop that out. That's gonna add some moisture to this bread. The baby food applesauce and the yogurt actually replace the butter and oil in a traditional recipe. So I'll add that. And then for a substitute for milk, I'm using my unsweetened almond breeze. Now almond breeze, again, I like this better than say soy or rice milk because it has, again, added protein. So it's just more nutritious and it's healthy fat, so I'll add that. I'm gonna do about 1 cup. And that's about it for my wet ingredients. Make sure I combine that really well. This is really a pretty simple recipe. And it tastes really, really good. It's, again, one of my favorites. You can actually make this in either the 8x8 like we're gonna do, or you can do it in a traditional loaf pan. Now that I've mixed all the wet ingredients, I'm gonna add the wet ingredients to the dry ingredients. So I'll get my large bowl back, and I wanna get my little rubber spatula so I can get all of the wet ingredients out of there. Just really scrape the bowl. The more moisture, the better, because then they'll be nice and moist and stay that way, not get dried out. So I've added the wet to the dry, and I'm going to mix that. And let's see. And you want it to be slightly runny because it needs to pour really easily. So if it's too thick, you can always add a little bit more of the almond breeze or almond milk, whichever brand you want to choose. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm always tempted to lick it, but I won't because there's raw eggs in there. So I'm now gonna set this to the side again because now I'm gonna start using my special dry ingredients. Here I've got my cinnamon and I've got xylitol. Now xylitol is the other brand of sweetener that I like to use, or the other type of sweetener, because this one, even though it's no calorie, it actually has carbs, but it is far less bitter than something like stevia. So I find whenever I use both, it kind of balances out that bitterness. So I'm gonna add my cinnamon to the xylitol. This is 1/3 cup. You can use more or less. I just like my cinnamon swirl protein bread pretty sweet. And I'm gonna add 2 or 3 teaspoons of cinnamon, again, however much you like. I added 3, I really like cinnamon, so I'll pour that in. Let me mix that up really well. Now xylitol does tend to be a little more granular than traditional sugar and more granular than the stevia. But I think that's good because it actually helps sort of maintain that layer that we're trying to create in our protein bread. And also, I don't know if you know, but xylitol is actually the same thing that's used in fluoride toothpaste, and it's actually good for your teeth. So imagine that, a sugar that's good for your teeth. So I think that's nice and mixed, looks pretty good. So now I'm gonna set these things aside, grab my pan. Now we'll start putting together our dessert. I'm gonna pour a really shallow layer on the bottom of the pan and kind of spread that out. The thinner the better, because if you pour half the batter, which seems like that should be fine, typically you're gonna kind of miss that little cinnamon layer that's in between. So I'll spread that out really well. That looks pretty good. And again, depending on your protein, the consistency of your batter might vary a little bit. So now I'm gonna add my cinnamon xylitol mixture. Cinnamon sugar, we'll just call it that. Sounds better. And it's pretty heavy. I like to actually add more than half. So that's covered pretty well. Got about that much left, I guess, for the top. And that's what my middle looks like. So then I'm gonna pour the rest of the batter on top. And you just kind of wanna do it where it's, you know, even. Make sure you get it all covered and all right, that looks pretty good. So I'm gonna spread that out. And then I'm just gonna add the rest of the cinnamon sugar on top. The nice thing about this too is that it looks really pretty. And if you make it actually in the loaf pan, you can cut slices and actually use it to make French toast, which is pretty good as well. So I'm gonna take my knife now, and to make it swirl, I'm gonna draw my knife through the batter. You can do it however you want, just kind of make sure it's incorporated. I just kind of go back and forth a little bit. Now I'm gonna put it in the oven that, remember, I preheated before at 350 degrees. Okay, it's been 24 minutes. Let's check our cinnamon protein bread. Your oven, depending on the temperature, they kind of vary. Sometimes it's 24 minutes, sometimes it might be more like 30 minutes. So let's check and see how ours looks. Okay, it looks pretty good. I think now we've got to let it cool down for about 5 to 10 minutes before we can actually cut it into serving sizes. Okay, now I'm going to cut this into serving sizes. Let's see, I do about 3 cuts this way, and then 3 in the opposite direction. And that should make 16 for your 8 by 8 inch pan. And about 2 squares really would be a serving size. For a guy, you could get away with maybe 3 or even 4 if you really, really want to indulge, I guess. But 2 squares is going to have, you know, just around only 100 calories, and it's about 8 or so grams of protein, about 8 carbs. It just depends on the type of protein that you decide to use. So looks pretty good. You can see the little, hopefully you can kind of see the little layer of cinnamon in there. It's a little harder to see here because my cutting skills are poor, but let's see what it tastes like. Tastes pretty good. You're gonna wanna make sure you store these in the refrigerator. There's no artificial flavors or preservatives. And also, if you wanna see how I pack these to take them with me when I travel, check out the pumpkin protein bar video. And for this recipe, check the bottom of the page. For even more of my recipes and articles, check out bodybuilding.com.